The Galactic cooperation vessel, Korreth's Pride, was by every measurable standard the most sophisticated diplomatic ship in the known star systems. It carried ambassadors from 47 species. It had a cafeteria that served 600 different atmospheric requirements. It had a swimming pool for the Velthari, a pressure chamber for the Dron, and a zero-gravity lounge for the Sefiri, who found gravity personally offensive and made no effort to hide that opinion. What it did not have, until approximately 3 standard rotations ago, was a human. Her name was Petra Voss. She was 29 years old by Earth's counting. She stood approximately 1.7 meters tall, which, by galactic standards, made her somewhere between laughably small and concerningly small. She had brown skin, short-cropped dark hair, and the kind of eyes that seemed to be permanently calculating something, even when she was supposedly relaxed. She had been assigned as the first human diplomatic observer aboard Korreth's Pride, a title that sounded important and meant, in practical terms, that she was supposed to sit quietly, watch how diplomacy was done among the elder species, and not cause any incidents. She had already caused 2 incidents, not through malice, not through incompetence, simply through the extraordinarily human habit of being exactly what she was, at full volume, without apology. The first incident had involved a Dron senior minister named Bulgroth, who had loudly stated at the welcome dinner that humans smelled like fermented soil and misplaced ambition. Petra had smiled at him, leaned across the diplomatic table in front of 40 senior delegates, and said very pleasantly, "You smell like something died in a sulfur bath and decided to stay. I figured we were just not mentioning it." Bulgroth had been so shocked that a species smaller than his leg had spoken to him in that manner, that he had knocked over 3 glasses and inhaled his own ceremonial smoke herb, which caused a coughing fit that lasted 11 minutes. The second incident was still being written up in official reports, but this story is about the third incident, the one that changed things, the one that nobody aboard Korreth's Pride would ever forget, no matter how many star rotations passed. The Velthari had cubs. This was, objectively speaking, a wonderful thing. The Velthari were a proud, ancient species. They stood between 2 and 3 meters tall, covered in layered scales that shifted between deep violet and burnished copper, depending on mood. They had 4 arms, 2 used for combat, and 2 used for the finer work of culture and craft. Their voices, even in casual conversation, registered at frequencies that rattled loose fixtures. They were, in the language of every species that had ever encountered them, terrifying. Their cubs, however, were something else entirely. Velthari young, before their scales fully hardened, were soft around the edges. They were curious in that wildly uncontrolled way that young creatures across every known species seem to share, regardless of biology, regardless of planet of origin. They explored. They touched things they were not supposed to touch. They roared at strangers, testing to see what would happen. Ambassador Vorrak, the senior Velthari delegate, had brought his 3 cubs aboard Korreth's Pride because the diplomatic mission was expected to last 6 standard months, and leaving young cubs without their parent for 6 months was, in Velthari culture, considered an act of psychological cruelty that even their enemies did not inflict upon each other. The cubs' names were Tikk, Sora, and the youngest, barely past her hatching season, Mav. Tikk was the boldest. Sora was the observer. Mav, small even by cub standards, followed the other 2 with the kind of boundless faith that only the very young possessed, the faith that said, "Wherever they go, I go, and nothing bad will happen, because nothing bad has happened yet." They had been watching Petra for 2 days, from behind corners. From the upper observation walkways where their small claws could hook into the railing and hold them suspended, looking down. From the doorway of the common eating area, where they peered in while she sat alone at a table with a cup of something hot and a datapad she was always reading. She was strange to them, soft, no scales, no visible claws. Her teeth, when she smiled, were flat and small. She moved without the weight their kind carried. She made sounds in a register their ears were not designed for, and yet those sounds seemed to carry meaning, because the other species aboard reacted to her speaking. On the morning of the 3rd day, Tikk made a decision. He was going to roar at her. This was, in Velthari cub culture, the standard test of courage. You found the most intimidating thing you could locate. You walked up to it, and you roared. If it flinched, you won. If it did not flinch, you were at least brave for having tried. Either way, you got a story. Sora told him this was a bad idea. Tikk told Sora that Sora always thought everything was a bad idea. Mom said nothing and followed along anyway, because she was Mom. Petra was in the secondary corridor on level 4 when it happened. She was walking from the communications suite back toward her quarters, datapad under her arm, cup of what passed aboard this ship for coffee in her hand. It was not really coffee. It was a synthesized approximation made by a food system that had been programmed by species who had never tasted coffee and were working entirely from a written description. It tasted like someone had read about coffee, written notes about coffee, lost the notes and then guessed. She drank it anyway. She was not in a position to be picky. She heard them before she saw them. The small click of claws on the corridor floor, the specific barely contained energy of young creatures trying to move quietly and failing, because quiet was not something the very young were built for. She did not look up from her datapad. She rounded the corner, and there was Tikk. He was standing directly in the center of the corridor, all 4 arms out, scales flushed to a bright copper that meant extreme emotional arousal, mouth open to display the first row of developing teeth that were nowhere near as impressive as he believed them to be. And he roared. By adult Velthari standards, it was nothing, a squeaky, half-formed thing that cracked in the middle and came out more as a sharp bark than a true roar. But by cub standards, by the standards of young and hopeful creatures, it was everything he had. Petra stopped walking. She looked at him. She looked at Sora, who was peeking around the corridor corner with the expression of someone who had already decided to have no part in whatever happened next. She looked at Maeve, who was behind Sora, visible only as 2 wide eyes and a patch of soft violet scales. She looked back at Tikk. Tikk was still in his roaring posture, arms out, but the confidence was beginning to leak from his expression, replaced by the specific uncertainty of someone who had expected a reaction and was not getting the expected one. Petra took a slow sip of her not coffee. She set her datapad under her arm more firmly. She took a single step toward Tikk, lowered herself to one knee so she was closer to his eye level, drew in a breath that, for a human, was genuinely impressive, and roared back, not a mimicry of a Velthari roar, not a mimicry, a fully human, chest from the gut, utterly uninhibited roar, the kind that Petra had, in her own past, deployed at a very confused bear in a national park at the age of 14, and which had worked then and apparently worked across species lines as well. For exactly 1 second, nobody in that corridor moved. Then Tikk sat down, very suddenly, on the corridor floor. Sora made a sound that was either a gasp or a laugh. Mom disappeared entirely behind Sora. Tikk stared at Petra with an expression that no translator in the known galaxy could fully capture, because it existed in the specific space between "I did not expect that" and "I have made a significant error in judgment." Petra held eye contact with him for 3 more seconds. Then she stood up, straightened her jacket, picked up her datapad, and walked past him down the corridor. She was 3 steps past him when she heard, very quietly, the sound of a small Velthari cub letting out a breath he had been holding for an uncomfortably long time. She did not turn around. She did smile, though, facing forward, where nobody could see it. Ambassador Vorrak found out approximately 40 minutes later. He found out because Tikk, to his credit, told him, which, in Velthari culture, was an act that required almost as much courage as the original roar, because Velthari cubs were expected to be brave, not embarrassed, and Tikk had been both. Vorrak sat in his quarters and listened to the full account. Every detail, the corridor, the datapad, the not coffee, the roar, the answer, the sitting down. He was quiet for a long time after Tikk finished. Then he said, "She roared back." "Yes," said Tikk, in the small voice of someone hoping that this information might somehow be received differently the second time. "Did she flinch first?" asked Vorrak. "No, not even a small flinch. A hesitation." "She took a sip of her drink first," said Tikk. "Then she roared." Vorrak was quiet again. Then something happened that Tikk had not seen in a very long time. His father, the senior Velthari diplomatic ambassador, veteran of 32 negotiation cycles, holder of the Korreth Diplomatic Medal of the Third Order, began to laugh. Not politely, not carefully, fully, deeply, with all 4 shoulders shaking and his throat crest flushing bright amber, the Velthari color of genuine unrestrained amusement. Tikk watched this with deep confusion, and something that might, in 30 years, become the ability to recognize a good story when he was inside one. "She roared back," Vorrak said again, still laughing. "She drank her drink first, and then she roared back." "I sat down," Tikk admitted. "I know," said Vorrak, and laughed harder. The story moved through Korreth's pride at the speed that good stories always move through contained spaces, which is to say very fast. By the evening meal cycle, every delegate from every species aboard had heard at least one version of it. The Sefiri, who communicated primarily through pressure waves and had to have the story translated 3 times before they understood the relevant emotional context, found it so interesting that 2 of them left the zero-gravity lounge, which they never did voluntarily, to go and observe Petra at dinner. Petra, for her part, ate her synthesized meal, read her datapad, and appeared entirely unbothered by the fact that she was being watched by most of the diplomatic corps of 47 species, which was of course its own kind of statement. The Dron minister Bulgroth, who had not forgiven her for the sulfur bath comment, sat at the far end of the dining hall and watched her with the particular expression of someone revising their initial threat assessment. He had spent 2 days thinking of her as a minor irritant, a soft-bodied curiosity from an underdeveloped world, a species barely worth cataloguing. The image of a creature that's small, that unscaled, that biologically fragile, taking one calm sip of a beverage and then roaring at a Velthari cub without one moment of visible hesitation, was making that assessment very difficult to maintain. He looked at his aide, a young Dron named Fess, who had also heard the story. "Find out," said Bulgroth. "What else is known about them?" Fess blinked. "The humans?" "The humans?" "The humans," confirmed Bulgroth, with the tone of someone who had begun to suspect they had been making a mistake. At the far end of the table, Petra looked up from her datapad, caught Bulgroth's eye across the room, and gave him a pleasant, entirely unconcerned smile. Bulgroth looked away first. Petra looked back at her datapad. The not coffee, on this particular evening, tasted almost acceptable. The next morning aboard Korreth's Pride began, like most mornings on a diplomatic vessel, with scheduled tension. There was a formal negotiation session at the 7th hour, involving the Dron and the Sefiri over contested mineral rights to a moon neither of them technically needed, but both of them very much wanted, on principle. There was a secondary meeting between the Velthari delegation and the Korreth Ship Council over navigation routing through the Pelvar corridor. There was a breakfast gathering in the upper commons where delegates were expected to mingle in a carefully structured way that was supposed to look spontaneous and fooled nobody. Petra attended all of it. She sat in the back of the negotiation room with a fresh cup of her terrible not coffee and her datapad, taking notes that nobody had asked her to take, watching everything with those quietly calculating eyes that had begun, over the past 3 days, to make several senior diplomats vaguely uncomfortable without being able to articulate exactly why. The Sefiri observer, a wide, pressure-sensitive being named Orvish, floated to the seat beside her during a recess break. Orvish communicated through a translation collar that converted pressure waves into spoken language, and the result sounded like someone talking through a very formal underwater telephone. The effect was deeply strange. Petra had stopped noticing it on day 1. "I have a question," said Orvish. "Go ahead," said Petra, not looking up from her notes. "The roar," said Orvish, "yesterday, in the corridor, was it deliberate?" Petra looked up at that. She considered the question with what appeared to be genuine thoughtfulness, which was, in fact, genuine thoughtfulness, because Petra did not do the fake kind. "Yes and no," she said. "The decision was deliberate. The roar itself was just what I had." Orvish processed this. The translation collar hummed quietly. "You decided to roar, but the roar itself was instinct, more or less. Do all humans carry that kind of response in their instinct?" Petra tilted her head. "We have a planet that tried to eat us for about 200,000 years. We had to develop something." Orvish was quiet for a moment. Then the collar produced a sound that the ship's cultural database flagged as a Sefiri expression of impressed reassessment. "I see," said Orvish. "That is contextually an illuminating answer." "I figured it might be," said Petra, and went back to her notes. The problem with Korreth's Pride, from a structural diplomatic standpoint, was that it was a vessel designed to showcase the power and cultural sophistication of the elder species. The Korreth, who had built it, were an ancient civilization that viewed themselves as the gracious shepherds of galactic order. They had extended membership in the galactic cooperation to younger species not out of altruism, exactly, but out of the specific brand of condescension that came wrapped in very polite language. Humans had been extended an observer status, not full membership, because the Korreth Council had reviewed humanity's history and produced a 1,200-page document concluding that humans were, and this was the diplomatic phrasing, not yet culturally stabilized enough for full participatory integration. Petra had read this document. She had made notes in the margins. She had submitted a 40-page counter-response. The Korreth Council had not responded to it, which she had taken as confirmation that they had read it, and found it uncomfortable. The head of the Korreth diplomatic mission aboard the vessel was a tall, silver-scaled being named Advocate Rennek. Rennek was ancient by most species standards, extraordinarily composed, and operated with the specific brand of polished authority that came from never having been genuinely surprised by anything in several centuries. The cub incident had surprised him, not the incident itself, the aftermath, the way it had rippled through the vessel, the way 47 species worth of delegates had recalibrated their read on the human observer overnight, not dramatically, not loudly, but in the quiet, constant way that mattered far more in diplomatic settings. He went to find Petra at the 10th hour, when she was in the lower observation deck watching the star field with the particular stillness of someone who did not find silence uncomfortable. "Observer Voss," he said, settling into the seat across from her. "Advocate Rennek," she said, with the easy courtesy she gave everyone, neither more nor less formal than the situation required. "I want to discuss the corridor incident," he said. "I figured someone would eventually," she said. "I was surprised it took this long." Rennek studied her. The observation deck was quiet, lit only by the slow drift of distant stars outside the viewport, and in that light Petra looked, he thought, exactly like what she was. Small, soft-bodied, quietly alert, a creature that had no business being in a room full of apex species, and had apparently not received that information. "The Velthari ambassador is not angry," Rennek said, carefully. "I want you to understand that. Vorrak's response has been, by all accounts, amusement." "I know," said Petra. "He sent me a message this morning." Rennek paused. "He sent you a message. Invited me to have a meal with his cubs this evening. Apparently Tikk specifically requested it." She looked out at the stars for a moment. "I said yes." Rennek sat with this information. He had been prepared for several versions of this conversation, and none of them had included the detail that the Velthari ambassador had personally invited the human to dine with his young within 18 hours of the incident. "The Dron minister," said Rennek, shifting direction with the practiced ease of a very old diplomat, "has requested a full information brief on humanity's species history." "I know that too," said Petra. "How do you know that?" Bulgroth's aide Fess asked one of the Korreth archivists for access to the Galactic Species Registry entry for humans, said Petra. The archivist mentioned it to the ship's records officer, who mentioned it to the communications aide I've been working with, who mentioned it to me. She paused. Ships are small, gossip is fast. Rennek looked at her for a long moment. "You are more observant than your brief suggested." "My brief said I was here to watch and not cause incidents," she said. "I've been watching very carefully. I've caused a few incidents. I figure the brief was approximately half right." Observer Voss. Rennek leaned forward slightly, and his silver scales caught the starlight in a way that would have been deeply intimidating to most species at close range. "I am going to speak plainly to you." "Please," said Petra. "The Korreth Council classified humanity as an observer species because your history is, by galactic standards, extraordinarily violent. Your world has been at war with itself for the entirety of your recorded civilization. You have extinguished species. You have reshaped ecosystems. You have done things to your own planet that most species would never do to an enemy's world." He held her gaze. "The concern is not that you are unsophisticated. The concern is that you are, in ways that are difficult to quantify, dangerous." Petra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And the question is whether dangerous is disqualifying." Rennek blinked. That was, with precision, exactly the question he had been building toward, and she had arrived at it before he finished his path. "Yes," he said. "Every species in this vessel had a violent history," said Petra. "The Velthari fought 6 extinction-level wars before they joined the cooperation. The Dron chemically sterilized 4 competing species before someone convinced them that conversation was more efficient. The Korreth," she said, and paused just long enough to be deliberate, "built this vessel as a monument to their own cultural authority, which is a power move, just a polite one." Rennek was very still. "I am not saying any of you are bad," said Petra. "I am saying that the difference between us and you is not the presence of violence, it is the timeline. You are older, your violence is further back. Ours is recent enough to still be in the records everyone reads when they look up humanity." She looked out at the stars again. "That is not the same thing as being more violent. It is the same thing as being younger." The observation deck was quiet for a long time. "You prepared that argument," said Rennek, finally. "I have been preparing that argument since I was assigned to this post," said Petra. I just did not know when the right time to use it was. She looked at him. I figured a direct conversation with the head of the mission was the right time. Rennek studied her with the full weight of several centuries of diplomatic experience. You are, he said slowly, not what I expected. Nobody ever expects us, said Petra. That is historically a mistake. The dinner that evening was, by any measure, extraordinary. Ambassador Vorrak had arranged a private dining space with Velthari atmospheric adjustments and a spread of food that represented the full range of both Velthari and human-compatible nutrition, which was more overlap than most species shared, because Velthari, like humans, were descended from omnivores who had eaten more or less everything their planet offered and developed digestion systems of remarkable flexibility. Tikk sat directly across from Petra and stared at her with the focused intensity of a young creature who has decided that a thing is interesting and intends to understand it completely. Sorry sat beside Tikk and tried to look like he was not also deeply interested. Mam sat beside her father and ate steadily, watching Petra from behind a piece of protein with the look of someone taking very careful notes. You did not flinch, said Tikk, about 3 minutes into the meal. No preamble, no warm-up. Direct, the way the young always were when they had been sitting with a question long enough. No, said Petra. Why not? Petra thought about this properly, the way she thought about questions that deserved real answers. Because flinching would not have helped me, she said. When something is trying to scare you, showing the scare gives them the thing they wanted. You were testing to see what I was. I figured I should show you something accurate. Tikk processed this with the focused expression of a young mind engaging with a concept that was larger than he had expected. But you are smaller than me, even now, even fully grown. Yes, said Petra. Then how does the not flinching work? If you are smaller, what does it mean that you are not scared? Petra picked up her cup. She looked at him. Size tells you what something is built from. It does not tell you what something has survived. She took a sip. I come from a world that was actively trying to end us for most of our existence. Predators, diseases, weather systems that did not care about us at all, and more than anything else, each other. She set the cup down. Something that has survived all of that does not flinch at a roar. It has heard worse. It has been the one roaring when the worst thing showed up. The table was very quiet. Ambassador Vorrak, who had been listening to this with all forearms folded and his scales settled in the deep violet of profound attention, said very quietly, "That is a Velthari way of thinking." "Maybe," said Petra, "or maybe it is just the way of anything that is still alive when it probably should not be." Vorrak looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, in the formal register of Velthari diplomatic address, which Petra's translation implant rendered in full, "You are small, Petra Voss of Earth, but you carry your scars forward, not behind you. That is what my people call strength of bone." Petra was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said, and meant it completely. Tikk looked between them, working through something. Then he said, "I want to try again, the roar, when I am better at it." "I hope you get better at it," said Petra. "Will you flinch then?" She looked at him across the table, this small violet-scaled cub with copper flushing at the edges of his face, and the specific look of someone who was going to grow up to be genuinely impressive, and said, "Come find me when you are ready, and we will see." Tikk held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he broke into the widest, most unguarded grin a developing set of Velthari teeth could produce, and went back to his food with the satisfied energy of someone who had just been given the best possible answer to the best possible question. 3 weeks later, the Korreth Council received an official supplementary diplomatic brief from Advocate Rennek, recommending a formal review of humanity's observer status designation with consideration for provisional full membership. Attached to the brief, in the notes section, were 2 items. The first was a partial transcript of a conversation in the lower observation deck. The second was a second-hand account, confirmed by 12 separate witnesses, of a human observer who had been roared at by a Velthari cub in a corridor, had taken 1 calm sip of a beverage, and had roared back without hesitation, without flinching, and without spilling a single drop. The council reviewed the materials. Then, for the first time in 400 years of documented galactic diplomacy, the Korreth Council amended a species classification in under a standard month. Humanity remained, technically, an observer species, but the word only was quietly removed from the designation. Nobody announced this. Nobody made a speech, but aboard Korreth's Pride, in the lower observation deck, very late in the ship's night cycle, Advocate Rennek sat across from Petra Voss, and slid a datapad across the table toward her without a word. She read it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her cup of terrible not coffee, which on this particular evening tasted, somehow, exactly right. "Thank you," she said. Rennek inclined his head. "You made the argument well." "I had help," said Petra, a cub with a very loud roar and very bad timing. Rennek made a sound that, after a long moment, resolved itself into something that might have been laughter. It was, Petra thought, a good sound. The stars drifted past the viewport. Korreth's pride moved on through the dark between worlds. And somewhere on level 4, in the corridor where it had all begun, 3 small sets of claws clicked quietly against the floor, heading towards something new,